Huh? 5,000 a month, but that would mean, wait, to rotate everyone out, you'd have to serve 7 years in Korea. I have a feeling that's a non-starter. Yeah, try telling the American public that's the plan, right? 7 years, huh? Okay. December 16th, 1951. You have aerial supremacy. Good for you. But one day, you send in a bunch of bombers to hit the enemy, and the enemy takes out all of them. Suddenly, you're not so supreme anymore. How does that make you feel? I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week at the Panmunjom Peace Talks, the issues of post-armistice inspection and what rebuilding, if any, should be allowed were the main talking and sticking points. Sticking points big enough to maybe sabotage the whole talks. The Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted a proposal to U.S. President Harry Truman for approval, though, which hopefully can move things forward. Truman approves the Joint Chiefs proposal and forwards it to UN Commander Matt Ridgway December 11th. There is detail behind that that's important here. I'll get back to it in a few minutes, though. For now, this gets the talks moving again after the UN side stalled most of last week until they could hear from Washington. The stalling actually produced a likely positive result. After much prodding, the communist side finally agreed to set up a sub-delegation on item 4 of the agenda, the POW issues, to exchange POW information with the UN guys. Meanwhile, they'll continue discussions about item 3, which again is concrete arrangements for the realization of ceasefire and armistice in Korea, including the composition, authority, and functions of a supervising organization for carrying out the terms of a ceasefire and armistice. I wonder how many times I've said that exactly. Anyhow, General Hsieh makes what seems to be the first step to breaking the recent deadlock when he somewhat tentatively asks if the UN side would accept the idea of neutral nations making the inspections to ensure that everyone is following the terms of an armistice if the communist side gives in on the maintenance of military force in Korea issue. Their proposal last week was that with an armistice, neither side could introduce any military anything into Korea, which the US very much opposes, and because they want to be able to rotate new personnel in and replenish forces. And if the communists agree that there would be one single administrative organ and not one for inspections and one in the demilitarized zone. This is likely just Hsieh probing, but it certainly increases the possibility of an armistice, right? So now having heard from Washington and General Hsieh, the UN issues a new proposal the 12th. It featured the concession by UN command of the islands along the coast and in territorial waters north of the demarcation line, and agreement to the concept that the neutral nations acceptable to both sides furnish personnel for the observer teams. On the other hand, the communists must permit rotation and replenishment and agree that the neutral nations be under the Military Armistice Commission. Since this was a package proposal, Turner told Hsieh that it must be accepted in toto or not at all. Turner is Howard Turner, a recent addition to the UN delegates, and not Turner Joy, UN delegate chief. At the next session, of course, Hsieh questions this proposal, especially attacking it concerning rotation and replenishment, despite his probing about conceding on it the session before, because maintenance isn't quite the same thing for some reason. Turner says that accepting the communist no replenishment principle would basically mean eventual troop withdrawal from Korea by attrition, right? But the communists agreed to discuss troop withdrawals under item 5, and this is item 3. So Turner scores a point here. Okay, point taken. The other side concedes. So how about, Hsieh asks the 14th, how about they accept the UN concessions and they concede that UN command could rotate in and out 5,000 troops a month? Here's the thing with that. The UN position was that replacements must be permitted on a one-for-one basis. Otherwise, normal rotation of American troops would not be possible. UN policy provided 1 year of duty in Korea for each man, or the replacement of about 35,000 men monthly. This meant a force of 420,000 men could be completely rotated in a year. Yet the communists proposed a rotation rate of only 5,000 per month, meaning a duty tour of 7 years for American soldiers in Korea and about 15 years for the Chinese, whose army numbered 1 million men. Turner thinks that's ridiculously low. Well, he calls it obvious nonsense. Also, upon a bit of questioning, Hsieh admits that even that 5,000 would have to be approved each month by the Military Armistice Commission, which the communist side will have equal representation in, so they could conceivably veto any rotation they like. As you can possibly guess, this makes the Hsieh proposal quite unattractive, so the talks again bogged down. So, the basic situation summed up. By mid-December, the communists had shown a disposition to compromise on inspection, the issue which the Joint Chiefs of Staff and UN command leaders had feared might be the greatest stumbling block to an agreement on Item 3. True, there remained many details to be worked out on the composition of the Neutral Nations Organization and its duty and relationship to the Military Armistice Commission, but the principles at least had been accepted. The enemy was also willing to retreat from its extreme stand against rotation, provided a suitable quid pro quo was offered. But the price for this concession, freedom to develop and rehabilitate airfields during an armistice, was one the UN command was vehemently opposed to. That makes sense, you know. The communist forces do not just now have one single operative airbase in North Korea. They're flying lots of planes around, sure, but these fly out of Manchurian bases. Turner Joy, not Howard Turner, worries very much that enemy rebuilding, which would likely increase combat effectiveness, is not what the UN wants in an armistice. If North Korean air bases are rebuilt, they could do airstrikes pretty deep into South Korea. He has this to say: "We of the UN delegation could see no reason why the communists should be allowed to develop an important military capability during the truce." He said that last week, actually. The Joint Chiefs wrote to President Truman, on vacation in Key West, that they wanted to override this. Truman's first thought was, fuck that. He won't give the communist forces permission to build North Korea, even if it means leaving the South in ruins for years. This is pretty much what he cables the Joint Chiefs and points out the enemy operates pretty well right now without airfields. So why should they be rebuilt? The Chiefs pointed out, as I did last week, that they have a feeling a military armistice is the only agreement they're going to get for a while. So it's not really practical to keep all of Korea in a state of devastation. It's also seemingly such an issue to the other side, they might break off talks over it. This manages to convince Truman. He greenlights their proposal. That's what I mentioned back at the very beginning, needed a little more detail. Ridgway worries the two sides at the truce table are drifting apart once again. I mentioned the communist side does not have one functioning airbase right now in North Korea, but there is a lot more to unpack there, which goes to why the other side really wants to be able to rehabilitate destroyed or damaged facilities. United States intelligence discovered in September 1951 that 3 particularly large airfields about 90 miles below the Manchurian border in northwestern Korea were being expanded and improved with amazing speed. Each of the fields, according to the Far East Air Forces, had runways of 6,400 feet or more. Air Chief Hoyt Vandenberg said back then, it was obvious that these were intended to be used with jet planes. They were also building pretty serious AA defenses around the fields. The communique about this read, while none of the fields has been put into operation, their use by enemy aircraft would give communist air power an effective operational range which could pose a menace to United Nations air and ground operations in the battle zone. Operations which have been virtually unopposed by enemy air since the early days of the war. It is true that since the North Korean Air Force was destroyed very early in the war, there have not been enemy planes over the actual battlefields. Well, the U.S. Air Force sent raids to these 3 fields under expansion. They hit Samcham back on October 18th with no enemy interference. Then Taechon, October 22nd, losing 1 B-29 Super Fortress bomber. The 3rd raid came October 23rd against Namsi airstrip. Now, this was the week in October I mentioned when more UN planes, including quite a few B-29s, were shot down in 1 week than had happened at all the whole war. The last of these raids was part of that. At Namsi, 8 B-29s escorted by 100 fighters were intercepted by 150 or so MiGs. and 3 of the bombers were shot down, and the other 5 all took damage. This came as a big surprise to Vandenberg, who told the press the day before how dominant they were in the air. Big enough that at a press conference a few weeks later, he lamented that a significant and sinister change has come in the air war over Korea. China has become a major air power, and UN air supremacy faces a serious challenge. I mention this now because anyone who has read last Sunday's New York Times Magazine has read Hanson Baldwin's article, The Challenge of the MiG, which is pretty eye-opening for the readers. What I'm thinking is that Vandenberg underestimates the situation. As Isidore Stone writes, the Air Force suddenly faced the prospect of losing control of the air over Korea. It found that the long-distance strategic subsonic bomber, on which the Americans had relied for delivery of an atomic bomb, was obsolete. It woke up to discover that the despised and technologically backward Soviet Union was producing better jet planes than the United States. I personally wouldn't say better. I'd say better in some respects, but you get the idea. As I said in October, the week of heavy enemy aerial interdiction caused the UN to shift from day to night bombing. That is an admission that the enemy has local control of the skies near targets like those airfields during the day. Still, although the Russians and Chinese hold superiority in numbers of planes and advantages of the MiG over the Sabre, they are unable to prevail against the Sabre jet pilots. That is for sure not the same thing as shooting down a slower bomber. I said 2 weeks ago that George Davis of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Group became an ace, and for the second time since he was an ace in World War II. He shoots down 4 more enemy planes the 13th, becoming the current highest scoring ace. In fact, this encounter, which is one of several fighter duels in the skies that day, all of which are lost by the communists, who lose 13 MiGs total, makes them a bit less eager to engage for the time being. There will be far fewer fights in the skies over the coming couple of weeks. I want to get back now to the Item 4 discussions, the POW stuff. The subdelegation to discuss Item 4 first meets already the 11th. Remember, a couple times in the past, I've talked about the issue of voluntary repatriation, right? Like, would they have to send back a POW to the other side who does not wish to go back? It's in a weird position by now. I mean, both Ridgway and the Joint Chiefs think it a desirable thing, right? But no one really knows how or even if it could be achieved. But also, there's no huge reason for sticking to their guns about it, should the other side make any suggestions that they'll keep hold of UN prisoners as retaliation. So when Item 4 talks get going, the voluntary or involuntary repatriation issue seems to depend on what the communist side does in future, actions or reactions from them. The Item 4 subdelegation is Lee Sang-cho and Tsai Ching-wen for the communist side, and Ruthven Libby and George Hickman for the UN side. Lee opens the whole proceedings by saying the entire POW issue can be quickly settled if all POWs are released and sent home after an armistice. If this is agreed on, then the little details could be straightened out easily enough without much trouble. However, the UN delegates are under orders to not start discussions of anything substantive until after the other side gives them a current POW list. So Libby kind of ignores Lee's proposal and pushes for the exchange of prisoner information. He also wants permission for the Red Cross to be allowed to come in and visit the POW camps. In the preliminary sparring that followed, Libby hinted that the UNC general position on POWs was fashioned around a fair and equitable exchange of prisoners, along with suitable supervision to ensure that they received humane treatment and comfort until they were repatriated. Naturally, the UN command desired to establish a priority for the transfer of sick and wounded prisoners. This is fairly generic, though. I mean, Lee wonders just what fair and equitable is exactly, and what it apparently means to the UN is that neither side gains an undue military advantage over the other should hostilities break out again before a final peace settlement is in place, which is still pretty vague. Lee has some other questions about terminology. Turner Joy tells Ridgway he has the idea the communist side is going to insist on an all-for-all repatriation and will oppose any variant of one-for-one. Ridgway's current focus, though, is on the idea of the Red Cross visiting the enemy POW camps, and is really trying to push that with his superiors. They like the idea, sure, but like just about everything, They don't want it to become an issue that could hurt the talks. Circles and circles. Frustrating. Well, with that frustration, I shall end this week of the Korean War, with the UN side not wanting the communist side to rebuild airfields post-armistice, and not wanting it because they've realized that communist air power as it is now has become a formidable force. That's got to be a sobering thought for UN command. I mean, at Namsi, they sent in 8 bombers, and all 8 of them got hurt or destroyed. 100% success rate for the enemy. Okay, the UN fares far, far better in terms of fighters, but for how long will that be true? Should the balance of power tip the other way, what in the world will be the result? The communist side did pretty well in the field without aerial support. How would they do with aerial supremacy? Well, winter is here, and everyone is scared for the future. And who knows what the future of Korea holds. But you can watch it unfold right here week after week, for better or for worse. That is thanks to the Time Ghost Army. It is the army that keeps the lights on for us. You can join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers, and Christoph S. period is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time. Playing with my ear.